The body was still warm when Hazel Morrow walked through the door, carrying 40 pounds of smoked salmon and a catering receipt that needed a signature. She didn't scream. That surprised her. Later, when she had the luxury of thinking about it, she'd always assumed she was a screamer. But when the double doors of the private dining suite at the Chateau Frontenac swung open, and the first thing she registered was a man slumped sideways off a Regency chair with foam drying at the corner of his mouth. What came out of her was not a scream. It was a very small, very controlled exhale, the kind she used when the elevator at her building was broken again, and she had to carry groceries up 6 flights. The second thing she registered was the guns. There were 8 of them, maybe 10, all swiveling toward her with the kind of unified precision that suggested the men holding them had done this before and found it routine. The room smelled like aged cognac and something chemical underneath that she didn't want to identify. At the head of the long mahogany table sat a man she recognized only because she'd seen his photograph in a sealed deposition file that had crossed her desk 3 years ago, before she lost the job that gave her access to such things. Rafferty Sinclair, 44 years old, half Irish, half Scottish, controlled 2 of the most significant private security contracting networks in North America, which was the polite way of saying he moved weapons across borders in ways that didn't require paperwork. He was looking at her the way a man looks at an unexpected problem he hasn't decided how to solve yet. Hazel looked back at him, then at the dead man on the floor, then at the 3 other men still seated at the table. None of them were Rafferty's men. That much was obvious from the body language, the suits, the very particular way they were not looking at each other. She recognized one of them, not from a file this time. From a photograph her linguistics professor had shown during a graduate seminar on post-Soviet criminal vocabulary. The man at Rafferty's left was Vasily Drozdov, and the last she'd heard, he controlled every import corridor through the port of Vancouver that wasn't officially audited. The man across from him was speaking, sharp, clipped syllables that bounced off the paneled walls. Hazel set down the catering bags, both of them, gently. "I understand," she said in Mandarin to the man who was speaking, "that you're angry about the delay, but shooting the caterer won't make the interpreter wake up." The room went very quiet. Rafferty Sinclair's eyes changed, just slightly, the way a chess player's expression shifts when the board rearranges itself into something unexpected. "You speak Mandarin," he said. His voice was low, controlled, and carried the faint cadence of someone who had spent years learning to sound like he belonged in every room he entered. Mandarin, French, Russian, Portuguese, and enough Georgian to get by in a negotiation. Hazel wiped her hands on her catering apron, which was navy blue, and had a small grease stain near the left hip that she'd never fully gotten out. "I also have a master's degree in applied linguistics from Dalhousie, which pays about as well as you'd imagine, which is why I'm standing here holding 40 pounds of smoked salmon at 11 o'clock on a Thursday." Vasily Drozdov said something sharp and guttural. Russian, working-class Moscow register, the kind that dropped consonants and blurred vowels in a way that most textbook-trained interpreters missed entirely. Hazel didn't miss it. "He's not asking a question," she said to Rafferty, without turning her head. "He's telling Zheng Wu that the original deal was structured around the interpreter's specific contacts in Rotterdam, and without him, the Rotterdam pipeline is void. He's also implying that if the pipeline is void, the financial guarantees attached to it are void. Which means..." She paused. "He's threatening you. Indirectly, but specifically." Rafferty was very still. "And the third man?" Hazel glanced at the man who hadn't spoken yet. He was older than the others, heavyset with thick silver rings on 3 fingers, and the kind of tan that came from a climate far warmer than Quebec in November. He was watching her with an expression that wasn't quite suspicion and wasn't quite amusement. "Give me a moment," she said. She listened into the way he'd shifted in his chair, the small sound he'd made when Drozdov finished speaking. It wasn't a word, exactly. It was a particular murmur she'd catalogued in her thesis on Brazilian Portuguese criminal dialect, specifically the Recife variant used in Sao Paulo's organized labor corridors in the 90s. "That's Edio Furtado," she said quietly. "He runs the Atlantic shipping routes. I don't know what he's doing in a meeting about Vancouver ports, but whatever Drozdov just said, Furtado doesn't like it. He used a sound, it's not quite a word, it's more like a tonal marker, that in his specific regional dialect signals that he thinks someone in this room is bluffing." Rafferty looked at her for a long moment. "Sit down, Hazel," he said. She blinked. "You don't know my name." He glanced at the laminated badge clipped to her apron. Hazel. Gold-crest Catering. She'd forgotten she was wearing it. She forgot she was wearing it most days. It was the kind of thing that became invisible when you spent enough hours carrying food through service entrances and being looked through by the people you delivered to. "Sit down," Rafferty said again. His voice had not changed in volume or tone, but something in it had shifted. It was the voice of a man making an offer he didn't usually make. "We can discuss your fee after." "My fee," Hazel repeated. "Name a number." She looked at the dead man on the floor. She looked at the guns, most of which were now lowered but not holstered. She looked at Rafferty Sinclair, who was waiting with the patient stillness of someone who had already run the calculations and was simply waiting for her to catch up. Then she looked at the smoked salmon she'd carried up 4 floors because the service lift was out. $150,000, she said. "Done." Canadian. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It might have been a smile. "Done." Hazel pulled out the chair to Rafferty's right, not the chair but beside the dead man, and sat down. The seat was too narrow for her hips. She wedged herself in anyway, planted her forearms on the mahogany, and looked at Vasily Drozdov. "All right," she said in Russian, "let's start again." The meeting ran for 4 hours. It was, Hazel thought at hour 3, the most remarkable and terrifying 4 hours of her life, which was saying something given that she'd once spent 6 weeks doing field interpretation in a region where power cuts and armed checkpoints were both considered routine. She translated contracts and veiled threats, and the very specific kind of underworld euphemism that required knowing not just what a word meant but what it meant when said by this particular man in this particular register to this particular audience. She caught 2 separate attempts by Drozdov to embed contractual language that would have given him exit clauses. Rafferty's legal team would have spent months untangling. She flagged them both. At one point, Furtado said something in Portuguese that was technically about fishing rights, and was actually about who controlled the insurance network on the cargo. "He's asking about the contingency," Hazel said to Rafferty quietly. "If the Rotterdam pivot fails, who absorbs the liability? He wants to know if you have a fallback or if this whole structure collapses with the dead man on your floor." Rafferty leaned toward her slightly. "Do we have a fallback? I have no idea. I deliver sandwiches for a living." This time the corner of his mouth definitely moved. "Tell him we have 2, she told Furtado. Furtado looked at Rafferty, then at Hazel, then back at Rafferty. He said something very brief in Portuguese. "He says you have good taste in interpreters," Hazel translated. "He's not wrong," Rafferty said. By the time the 3 men stood to leave, the provisional terms were set. Drozdov paused on his way out and said something to Hazel directly. His tone had changed. The bristling aggression was gone. In its place was something grudging and almost respectful. "He says I translate like someone who's been in the room before," Hazel said to Rafferty when Drozdov was gone. "Which I think was a compliment." "It was," Rafferty said. "Vasily doesn't offer those." When the doors finally closed, Hazel sat alone in the chair that was too small for her, in a room with a dead man and the remains of a smoked salmon spread that no one had touched. She was shaking, she realized, both hands, fine tremors that she could feel in her fingertips. Her lower back ached from sitting rigid for 4 hours. Her feet hurt from standing on the service floors before that. Rafferty poured 2 glasses of something amber and expensive and set one in front of her. She drank it without asking what it was. "The transfer," she said. "It'll clear tonight. And I just..." She stopped, looked at her hands. "Walk away." Rafferty sat down across from her. He looked, for the first time since she'd entered the room, like someone who was allowing himself to have an expression. "That's the question, isn't it?" Hazel stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means that Vasily Drozdov now knows your face. Edio Furtado has very likely already had someone run your catering badge. Zheng Wu didn't say much tonight, but men like Zheng Wu do a great deal of thinking between meetings." He paused. "You walked into a room that most people don't walk out of. The fact that you're walking out changes the topology of what these men think is possible." Hazel absorbed this. Outside the Budozu's city was lit up in the dark, the old stone walls of the lower city amber and grey under the November sky. "So I'm not safe," she said. "Not particularly, because I sat in your meeting and did your job for you, because you did it better than anyone I've employed in 6 years." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in the way he said it that wasn't flattery. It was assessment, the same tone he'd used to agree to her fee without blinking. "I'm not a criminal," Hazel said. "No," he said. "You're a linguist who delivers catering because the world didn't have enough sense to use you correctly." He tilted his head slightly. "I tend to correct those kinds of inefficiencies by offering me a job, by making an argument," he said, "that you're going to find difficult to dismiss when you think about it clearly." He stood, buttoned his jacket, and moved toward the door with the unhurried certainty of a man who had learned long ago that urgency was a form of weakness. "You'll stay here tonight. It's arranged. Tomorrow we can discuss specific. You can't just—" "I know," he said. "I'm not. You can walk out of this building in the morning if you want to. The transfer will still clear." He paused at the door. "But Furtado's people will have your home address by 6 a.m., Hazel, and Vasily's reach in this city is longer than the transit map." He looked at her over his shoulder. "Think about it." He left. Hazel sat in the too small chair in the too quiet room and thought about it. She stayed, not because she'd made a decision exactly, more because the alternative required a clarity she didn't have yet at 2 in the morning in a room that still smelled faintly of whatever had killed a man in it. The suite she was taken to was on the 6th floor. It was larger than her apartment in the Plateau Mont Royal, which wasn't saying much, but the bed was real, and the locks worked, and she slept without dreaming for the first time in months. In the morning, there was coffee, and a message from Rafferty, brief, asking if she'd eaten. She had not eaten. She told him so, and 20 minutes later, someone knocked and left a tray in the hall without waiting for a response. Eggs, sourdough, a small pot of dark tea, a glass of orange juice that tasted like it had been squeezed that morning. Hazel sat in the chair by the window in yesterday's clothes and ate all of it and watched the St. Lawrence River glint in the pale winter light and tried to think about her life with some objectivity. She was 31. She had a graduate degree she was making no use of. She had an anxiety disorder that had ended her last 3 professional positions, not because she wasn't capable, but because the pace and the politics and the performance of corporate interpretation work wore her down in a way that she'd never quite been able to explain to anyone who hadn't experienced it. She had $1,200 in her checking account. She had a catering job that paid $22 an hour, and a landlord who had mentioned twice this quarter that the building might be converting to condos. And she had, apparently, conducted a 4-hour trilingual criminal negotiation the night before and been told she was the best interpreter a dangerous man had employed in 6 years. She pulled out her phone and looked at her bank balance. The transfer had cleared. She set the phone down on the windowsill very carefully. Rafferty came himself an hour later. He knocked, which surprised her. He came in, carrying his own coffee, which surprised her more. "You look like you slept," he said. "I did. Your sheets are better than mine. Most things here are better than most things elsewhere. It's what the nightly rate buys you." He sat in the chair across from her without asking. He was in a different suit today, charcoal with a faint chalk stripe, and he looked as though the events of the previous evening had cost him nothing. She had the feeling this was not performed composure. She had the feeling it was simply the operating temperature of the man. Tell me what you want from me, Hazel said. Specifically. He told her. It was detailed and thorough and took 20 minutes. He needed someone who could work across the languages she spoke, and potentially others she could acquire. He was specific about that, as if new languages were simply a matter of allocation, to sit in on negotiations, read subtext, flag what was being communicated underneath what was being said, and advise him on the gap between the two. It was the job, he said, of someone who could be in a room and be simultaneously trusted and overlooked. You mean invisible, Hazel said. I mean underestimated, he looked at her steadily. I need people to be surprised by you, Hazel. In this line of work, surprise is leverage. She thought about the way Drozdov had looked at her, the recalibration in real time. The moment his aggression had shifted into something that, from a man like that, functioned as respect. And if I say no, she said, then I'll make arrangements to manage the Furtado and Drozdov situation as best I can. It will take time and resources, but it's not impossible. He set down his coffee. And you'll go back to smoked salmons and service elevators. Hazel looked at her hands. They had stopped shaking. I need my own space, she said. Not here. Not somewhere you've arranged. My own, fine. And I'm not carrying a weapon, ever. I'm not asking you to. And if I think a meeting is going sideways in a way I don't have the skill to manage, I'm allowed to say so. I'm not going to sit in a room and pretend I can navigate something I can't. That, Rafferty said, is more professional integrity than most people I employ, because most people you employ are afraid to tell you the truth. He looked at her, and this time there was something in his expression that wasn't assessment and wasn't amusement, and was something she didn't have a clean category for yet. Yes, he said, that's exactly right. The first 3 months were a study in controlled disorientation. Hazel moved into an apartment in St. Roch, in the lower city, because the rent was manageable and the walk to the river helped her think, and Rafferty's people could get to her in under 7 minutes if they needed to, which was the kind of calculation she'd had to start making. She bought better shoes. She let her catering apron gather dust in the back of her closet. She went to 7 meetings, 4 in Montreal, 1 in Halifax, 1 in Ottawa in a private room at a hotel that was listed as a conference facility for a law firm that did not appear to exist, and 1 on a chartered boat in the Gulf of St. Lawrence that she was not given advance warning about, and which she handled by translating a 2-hour negotiation between Rafferty and a man from Marseille while drinking ginger tea in an attempt not to be seasick. She got better, not at the languages. She was already good at those. She got better at reading people, at sitting in a body that other people dismissed and using that dismissal as a kind of intelligence-gathering tool. People said things near Hazel that they wouldn't have said near someone they considered a threat. They assumed that a large, quiet woman in practical clothes was either staff or furniture. She let them assume. In November, 2 weeks before the 1-year mark of the night, she'd walked into the wrong room with 40 pounds of smoked salmon. Rafferty's contact in Toronto sent an encrypted file. She was copied, which still occasionally surprised her. The file contained transcripts of a series of calls between Vasily Drozdov's operation and an unknown party. The transcripts had been generated by an automated system that had struggled badly with the dialect. The automated notes read like a partially solved puzzle. Hazel looked at them for 20 minutes and then called Rafferty. The automated transcript is wrong, she said when he picked up, in 17 places, and in 3 of those places, the error changes the meaning of the entire exchange. A pause. How wrong? Wrong enough that whoever briefed you on what Drozdov's been saying this quarter gave you a completely different picture than what he's actually been saying. She had her notes spread across the kitchen table, the heating vent rattling below the window in the way it always did after 9 in the evening. He's not moving on the Rotterdam pivot. He's already moved. The language he's using is past tense. Specifically, he's using a verb construction that in this dialect indicates completed action. He's done it. Silence on the other end of the line. He's been playing you, Hazel said, for at least 4 months. Whatever he agreed to in Quebec City, he never intended to deliver it. More silence, and then low and careful, "Are you certain?" 92%, she said, which in linguistics is about as certain as it gets. She heard him exhale, a very controlled sound. The kind of exhale that a very controlled man allows himself when the information he's receiving is significant enough to require one. "I'll need you in Toronto," he said. "I know. Tomorrow. I know, Rafferty. You're extraordinary," he said. It wasn't the way someone says it when they're trying to make you feel good. It was the way someone says it when they're processing a fact. "I know that too," Hazel said. "It's the world that keeps forgetting. The Toronto situation took 11 days. She stayed in a hotel. She chose herself on a floor she specified, and she ate the good Thai place around the corner from the office 3 times, because when everything else was uncertain, having a reliable dinner was not nothing. On the 8th day, they were in a boardroom on the 43rd floor of a glass tower over the lake when everything shifted at once. Rafferty received a message. He looked at it, and his face did the thing it almost never did, which was change. He leaned toward her. "Drozdov has a man in the building," he said quietly. "Right now." Hazel looked at the men across the table. 3 of them. 2 were Rafferty's people, one she'd been introduced to as a neutral broker. She looked at the broker. He was not looking at anyone, he was looking at his phone, which was face down, very still. "The broker," she said, too quietly for anyone else to hear. "He just used a filler phrase in Russian. Under his breath when he thought you'd stopped watching. He doesn't know I caught it. It's a confirmation phrase. The kind you use when you're reporting position on an open line." Rafferty's eyes stayed on the table. "He's been signaling. For the last 40 minutes, she could feel the shift in him, the recalibration. "Buy me 4 minutes," he said. Hazel leaned forward. She started asking the broker about logistics, detailed questions, dates, routes, the specific customs infrastructure in the port of Prince Rupert. She knew enough from the previous months to ask intelligent questions. She let him talk. She asked follow-up questions. She kept him looking at her, which required something she had learned she possessed. The ability to make a man feel, despite everything his instincts told him, that she was not someone he needed to manage. It was a skill that had never served her at any corporate desk job. Here it was one of the most valuable things she owned. Rafferty returned 5 minutes later, and the broker's usefulness in that context ended shortly after, though not in the way Hazel had briefly been afraid of. Rafferty's methods were, in her experience, more surgical than that. On the 11th day, they were in the back of a car heading to the airport when Rafferty looked at her directly for the first time in hours. "Drozdov knows you're the reason the Rotterdam intelligence got corrected," he said. "I know. He's taken an interest in you, the threatening kind or the offer to make me a queen kind." She was looking out at the lakeshore, the January light flat and white over the ice. "Somewhere between the two," Rafferty said. "Which is more dangerous than either. Lovely. You could travel with more security. I don't want more security." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the highway opened up. "You're not afraid," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm terrified constantly," Hazel said. "I've just gotten very good at functioning while terrified." It's a skill you develop when you're someone the world keeps deciding isn't worth worrying about. She felt him look at her. "The world," Rafferty said, "was wrong." She turned her head and looked at him. In the pale winter light, his face was harder to read than usual, which was saying something. "You knew that," he said, "before you ever walked through that door in Quebec City." "I knew it," she said. "I just didn't have anywhere to put it yet." The airport appeared ahead of them, and she turned back to the window. In the reflection, she could see both of them. She looked the same as she always had. Big, ordinary, the kind of woman who got looked through. But something behind her eyes had shifted in the last year. She could see it herself now. Whatever it was, it sat differently in her face. Rafferty's hand rested on the seat between them. Hers was 6 inches away. Neither of them moved, and neither of them didn't. "There's a situation developing in Vancouver," he said. "The port. Drozdov's people and someone new. I don't have a read on the language. What dialect? Uncertain. Cantonese variant, possibly, but the reports are inconsistent. Give me the reports. I'll read them on the plane. He sent them. She was halfway through by the time they boarded. She was done by the time they reached cruising altitude, and she'd drafted a preliminary assessment by the time the lights of the prairies appeared below them in the dark. She sent it to him. Across the aisle, she watched him read it, watched the stillness of his face, which she'd learned to read now in the same way she read dialects. Not for what it showed, but for what it didn't. He looked up. His expression held the same thing she'd seen in Quebec City in the moment everything shifted. The look of a man recalibrating to new information. In 5 languages, he said quietly, almost to himself. 6, Hazel said. I've been working on Cantonese. His mouth curved. It was a real smile. She'd catalogued enough of them to know. Small and precise, and a thing he didn't give out carelessly. Of course you have, Rafferty Sinclair said. She looked back at her notes and the darkness outside, and somewhere below them the country she was good at navigating unseen slid past in the dark. And for the first time in a very long time, Hazel Morrow felt exactly like what she actually was. The most dangerous person in any room she chose to enter.